you all this afternoon. Thank you so much for being here. This is the, I guess, fourth official event in our series of talking to all of you about our strategic plan efforts and what we're doing as a school district. And we're really, really happy and fortunate today to have Dr. Deborah Stipek with us. And just a little bit about Deborah. Put my glasses. Dr. Stipek is currently a professor at Stanford University in the Department of Education. Good for us. And has been there for a number of years. She was the Dean of the School of Education from 2001 to 2011. She received her PhD in developmental psychology from Yale University and her bachelor's degree from the University of Washington. Go Huskies, I didn't know. Her research concerns instructional effects on children's achievement, motivation, early childhood education, elementary education, and school reform, all topics near and dear to our hearts. In addition to her research, Dr. Stipek has an interest in policies affecting children and education. She served for 5 years on the board of Children, Youth, and Families at the National Research Council. She was the chair of National Research Council Committee for Increasing High School Students' Engagement and Motivation to Learn, and she directed the MacArthur Foundation Network on Teaching and Learning. While a professor at UCLA, Dr. Stipek served as director of the Corinne Seeds University Elementary School, the lab school there, and the Urban Education Studies Center. And she has written a number of books, including Motivated Minds, Raising Children to Love Learning. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Stipek. So we have her here for about an hour and a half this afternoon. We're going to take full advantage of that time, and we have 3 topic areas to discuss around our interest in school reform: public schools and future directions affecting schools and students. So we're going to start out, we're going to have each of these 3 areas. I'll introduce a sort of general question, have Dr. Stipek talk a bit about that, take some questions in that area, and then move to the next topic and then the final topic. I'm sure it won't go that smoothly, but that's the plan. So, our first topic. So we want to ask you what you see as the role of a K-8 public school in a community like Portola Valley. What priorities do you think the school should have, and where should we aim to be on the spectrum of instructional innovation?
I thought that was 3 questions.
We sneak a few extras in there.
All right, if I don't remember all of them, you can remind me as we go. So I think the first one was, what is the role of a school like, a school system like these, or schools like these in Portola Valley? Yeah. How's that? Better? Let me know if I start talking too softly. There are lots of schools in the last couple of decades that have developed that are really specialized in particular kinds of areas. So you've got magnet schools, you've got charter schools, there have been private schools for many years that may have a technology orientation or science orientation or some specific theme that characterizes the school, or even a particular approach, Montessori school approach to instruction. I think that's good because I think it gives family choices. But when you're talking about a public school that needs to serve the entire community, what to me is the most important is that it does in fact serve the entire community. It's harder to have a very, very particular and potentially exclusive theme or approach in a school that really needs to meet the needs and serve all of the children in the community. So the highest priority is that the instructional approach and the values and the kind of instruction that children experience is really suitable and appropriate for all of the children. I hate to quote legislation, but it does have to be the kind of instruction that will leave no child behind. And some of the magnet schools and charter schools and that sort of thing with a very particular orientation are really not good for some children. And I don't think schools like those in Portola Valley that are public schools have that option, unless it's something that the entire community is really behind and that you're very confident will serve all children's needs. So then the next question was
so given that, I mean, so when you think about general priorities and what's important in schooling today. What do you think, given that restriction or opportunity, depending on how you look at it, where do you see that?
First of all, the priorities to some degree are not within your control. There are state standards, and I want to come back to talk about those because they've changed quite a lot and have really important implications for your school, as they do all public schools in the 46 states that have adopted the Common Core. So to some degree, those are going to have to serve as guidelines for the priorities that you set for children's learning. But in addition to those, I think the community has a lot of opportunity, and this is a good time for this community to do this, to really think about what do we really care about? What do we believe are important qualities, understandings, and so on for our children to be successful, and the kind of people that we want them to be in this new century. I guess it's not that new anymore, is it? And those, I think there's a fairly good evidence, or at least there's a fair amount of consensus, that things like being able to collaborate and cooperate with others, being an innovative thinker, not just being able to copy. I mean, the Chinese are finally realizing that their education system has promoted great copiers, but they're now realizing that their economic future depends on people who have some ability to innovate, and now they're scrambling to try to figure out how to change their education system so that they can support that. We have a little bit more of a history of that in this country. Critical thinking and analysis is something that many people, I think, are beginning to understand is much more important in an era where children and adults have access to a huge amount of information which is changing on a daily basis, and much of which is wrong. So when I was a kid, if I wanted to know something, I could go to the Britannica encyclopedia, and at least I would find information on it there was some consensus was in the ballpark of being right. Now, if a child wants to know about the Civil War, and they put in Google the Civil War, they'll get probably 50,000 or 100,000 hits, and they have to somehow find their way through this morass of information and misinformation and make sense of it. Much harder than it was for, at least for me. You're a lot younger than I am, most of you, so you're kind of in between. But I think it's much more demanding in terms of intellectual skills than we ever had before. So and then there's character issues, and many communities care a lot about the children having opportunities to develop kindness and that's right, and all kinds of qualities. And those are things that I think the community has to come together and decide and make those priorities. So I would start with the Common Core, and then I would have conversations about what that's not on the Common Core do we really care about. And that then begins to help you determine what the instructional program should be, what the curriculum should look like, what the teacher professional development should look like, and so on. But if you don't know where you want the kids to be, you can't figure out what the pathway is. And it is a matter of making priorities, because if you give teachers 400 things that you want them to do for your kids, they're going to take the top 10 or maybe top 5. So I think it's really good for communities to have conversation. Let's say, for example, technology. How important is it to this community that their kids be very savvy technologically? Different communities vary on that. We are in Silicon Valley, so you may rate it much higher than someone in the Central Valley would. But I think those are important conversations to have.
Questions from the grapevine? This is brought up for you.
What?
Can you talk a little bit about the Common Core and how it's different from the old standards?
Yeah, I was going to do that. I want to come back to the other, I think the third question was how much innovation, so I want to come back to that eventually, but see, I did remember that.
It's just testing.
Yeah, I think you got a handout on the Common Core. I assume you, as many people, have been somewhat frustrated by the assessments that our schools have been, and our children have been, and our teachers have been evaluated by. very narrow. First of all, it's just reading and math, for the most part, at least under No Child Left Behind. There's a little bit more under API for the state of California, but reading and math get the lion's share of it. And what we have seen in many schools across the country since No Child Left Behind is that even things like social studies and science have just fallen aside. So not only we've narrowed the topics or the domains of knowledge that we think are important for children, overly narrowed them in my personal view. We've also narrowed what we think of understanding, knowing a topic, whether it's reading or math. It has to be assessed with a multiple choice test. There are things you can assess with a multiple choice test, but they're very limited. And so you can't assess whether a child can actually develop an idea or develop an argument or support an argument or things that, or critically read something. Things that I think most of you would consider to be critically important in whatever they want to do, and just being a citizen. The Common Core is, to some degree, a response to that. It's fascinating how this came about. It was actually governors of states that gave rise to the Common Core. They came together, or at least the people who represented them from the state offices of education came together to design a set of standards from the ground up. Never refer to them as national standards. I have made that mistake occasionally and gotten slapped around because national standards are politically unacceptable. But states can adopt a shared set of standards. So it was politically much more acceptable. It's why it's called the Common Core instead of the National Core or the Federal Core or something like that. They brought in experts, and the emphasis was thinking more 21st century skills, although I don't know why we think that critical thinking is only needed in the 21st century. I think probably even in the 20th century it was useful. But it's like people have said, well, now for the 21st century we need critical thinking. Okay, so we discovered that it's important, that's fine. So there's much more emphasis on using knowledge in novel situations. You don't just have to know math. You have to take what you know in math and apply it in a new problem setting. Something which kids have not been asked to do. It's a performance test, the tests that are being developed to go along with it. So kids are actually writing, they're analyzing, they're, even the young children. So they're having to design, for example, a science experiment. They're having to explain the solution that they have given for a particular math problem and so on. So it's much more, it takes much deeper understanding to do well on these new tests than I think it has on the multiple choice test. I've looked at the tests. You can actually go online and see some of the items for the tests and what they're looking like. And it's not just harder, but it's much more demanding intellectually. Now for this community, I would think you would embrace this with great enthusiasm because it's much more the kind of teaching and learning that I think what I know about Portola Valley is quite enthusiastic about, and appropriately so. So it's like the world, California or the world is catching up with you guys in many respects. I think for most of the country, I don't think they really realize what's hit them. There are a lot of districts, a lot of places where they are scrambling like crazy because they know that the curriculum and the teaching that they've been doing is totally unsuitable for the new assessments that the kids are going to be taking, and trying to figure out how to fundamentally change the way they teach because they've been doing multiple choice teaching and it won't work for this.
I guess my question is, are the Common Core standards, are they different for public schools than they are for private schools?
Private schools have their own standards. They are not held to state standards. Okay. These are state standards. Every state, all 50 states and DC have a set of standards. We always have, or not always, but California's had their standards for quite a few years. The only difference is that the states have decided that they're all going to adopt the same set of standards. But private schools are not on them. Now, magnet schools and charter schools, they do apply to them because they are publicly funded schools.
Right.
Are these assessments already in place, the kind that you're talking about, the non-multiple choice?
No. There are two large assessment teams that the federal government is paying for. They're consortia of universities and organizations that do test development. And these two consortia are developing two sets of tests. Most states have kind of aligned themselves with one or the other. They're in the development phase, and I think they're phased in 2014 in California. I think that's the plan. But that's like tomorrow when you think of, you know, especially schools that are not like that are not in Portola Valley and have had very, very traditional teaching.
And what resources are being given to school districts to help facilitate the change, or is it the school district that has to manage the...
In California?
Well, there are probably 3 times a day I get an email suggesting I pay for a webinar about implementing Common Core standards, and so far I've resisted most of those because I don't think even the people who are creating those webinars quite yet know exactly what this is all going to look like and how to implement. One good thing, though, is that it's more of a top or a grassroots or bottom-up process. A lot of teachers involved, a lot of educators involved. In fact, Smarter Balance Assessment, which is what we will be using in California. There's Linda Darling-Hammond is one of the chief writers on that, as is David Foster, who is part of the MARS assessment, which we give in our district already and have given for a number of years. So we're really well positioned. I think, as Deborah said, one of the things that's fortunate for us is that it won't be, we do what we normally do and then we stop what we do for 2 weeks and give these tests that look very different to our kids than what they normally encounter. We'll actually have tests that look a lot like what we do in our normal school day, which I think will help. But in terms of really understanding, we are going to be looking at some training opportunities for staff. We're already having staff attend some things locally, and we're going to look at joining up with Las Amitas this summer to do some training for teacher teams on really implementing it. And it's a lot of self-study and understanding. One thing about the Common Core, and tell me if you disagree, but I think it puts the teaching, the ideas about how to teach and what to teach really much more in the hands of the professional teachers and gives them an opportunity to really be a lot more creative with content, because it's about learning processes as opposed to memorizing a set of information that's prescribed by somebody who thinks, you know, this is what's important for you to learn. So I think it's actually very freeing in a way, but it will be much harder in terms of really developing curriculum for everybody. Of course, the textbook companies will get involved pretty soon too.
Oh. Every textbook company is stamping consistent with the Common Core in their books. I'm not sure they're making that much difference. One thing that is different in the Common Core is much more emphasis on informational text. And much less emphasis on novels and that sort of thing. And so even in kindergarten, they're promoting having kids learn their reading skills and science skills and that sort of thing from reading text that is informational rather than not storybooks. And that's quite a shift.
One of the things that was mentioned when you were talking about the Common Core standards were also having the community decide what should be a part of those course standards for the community or for the school district. And I was just wondering if, and character was something that was brought up, which is a personal thing of mine that's really important to me, because I believe that if the kids are well balanced and have good character and so on, that they will thrive in their academics as well. And I'm just wondering if that's part of the strategic planning process, coming up with a core set of values that we as a community want to be a part of our core standards, and or how that's going to work in terms of adding to it? Or
Well, I mean, some of that is it's a little early in our process. We've just identified a facilitator, and one of the first things we're going to do is a needs assessment and a data review to really understand where we are as a community, what we value as a community, and what we want to see going forward. From that, I can't imagine we'll develop a strategic plan that doesn't have very high in the priorities character education and really student well-being and not just the academics but the whole child approach. There's no way. I mean, that's been a high point in all the school plans that we've developed over the years, and so, but there will be an opportunity, just as there is today. I mean, there's somebody writing down everything, and not to mention we're being filmed by 3 different cameras. So we're getting it. So and there'll be many opportunities for you to weigh in and tell us what you value, what you want to see happen there.
People are also talking a lot about, the economists call them non-cognitive skills or something like that. I'm not sure they're really non-cognitive, but you've probably heard of grit. Grit has become like the most important thing for all of people to be able to be successful in life. Grit is this kind of perseverance, staying power, working hard, and that sort of thing, which has been discovered recently. I think this is what science does. It figures out what we all knew before.
It validates common sense.
Yeah, exactly. Well, sometimes it doesn't. It doesn't, but in any case, I think it's really sort of healthy to look at what some of these people are talking about. Look at the evidence. There is actually scientific evidence on some qualities and how they correlate or predict later success. So there are values that you care about just because they're your family values. And there are qualities that actually seem to be predictors in addition to academic skills of whether it's success in college or success in life. So being informed about that evidence is useful. Can I go into the technology question? So one of them was how
Where should we be on the spectrum on
how
innovation?
How innovative should we be? And I think that's sort of the wrong question in a way. I probably should have said this when you sent it to me. You start with the goals. You start with the learning goal or where you want the child to be. And then you back up and say, how do we get our children there? And in some cases, you're going to come up with really creative, different ways of getting them there, because the traditional ways or the ways that you've been doing don't seem to be working very well. In some cases, you're going to come up with very traditional ways. I mean, multiplication tables are useful to know. You know, I've sort of forgotten them, and I find it, you know, I have to go find my little, just to do a simple multiplication problem, I have to go find my little calculator. Well, that's ridiculous. So, you know, I don't know, there are probably some interesting and fun ways to teach multiplication tables, but it's kind of it's not what you would consider very innovative in terms of an area of academic work. So I think you're going to have a mix, and you have to try things. There are ways in which technology now can be used in very innovative ways. I mean, there are some innovations in technology that may work very effectively for meeting particular kinds of demands. One of the things that I've seen in some schools is using online learning for kids who have fallen behind in very specific kinds of skills. So there are specific things they missed in math. Maybe they were absent, maybe it just took them longer to kind of process the instruction. And so having an opportunity to be able to sit down with a computer and go to Khan Academy or something like that and pick up that skill it can be very productive to help the class move on and not have some children get too far behind. So look at those options, look at what's being tried out. There are lots of innovative, interesting things to do, but I don't think innovation for the sake of innovation is what you want to do. I think innovation for the sake of achieving a learning goal better than you would be able to do it with a more traditional approach is really the way to think about it.
I just wanted to say that I have multiplication tic-tac-toe for you.
I have seen some pretty interesting and fun ways to teach multiplication. But I know in the school that I directed, my daughter still complains that she never learned the multiplication tables because it was just too progressive. The other thing, I was director of the school, so I can't really complain too much. The other thing she claims that she really wished she had when she went off to high school was basic grammar. She has absolutely no idea what the difference between a verb and a subject is because that was too traditional. So there was, I lived with this kind of don't teach traditional stuff because we need to be innovative. And I think it's important to know when you use a semicolon and when you use a colon. I mean, there's just all kinds of stuff that we need to know are useful and can be embarrassing on job applications when you don't know it. So I think you just need the broad spectrum of things. Once you've decided what kids need to learn, which is directed to a substantial degree by the Common Core, then you use the methods that are, and if you've got tic-tac-toe or if you have ways to do it that get the kids engaged and make it a lot more fun than just memorization, then that's great.
Well, no, go ahead. So to piggyback on what we think is important for them to learn, just talking more about these multiplication tables. I mean, most mathematicians don't know their times tables because they're thinking in a totally different way. So we can say that that's important, and we think it is. So how do we know what is going to be important for our children that are going to need to know such different things? Do you know?
Yeah.
How do we know what?
Well, first of all,
going to be
first you've got the Common Core, and I don't know if the Common Core requires you to know your multiplication table, but it sure requires you to understand multiplication. And so you start with the Common Core. Then it's gonna have more than you can probably do, and there are gonna be other things that you might want to add to it. You have to do that as a community. I suspect that most people in this community are not assuming that their children will become mathematicians. And they want their children to have the kinds of skills that give them a lot of options. So from K-8, I don't know that you want to really prepare kids in a way that now predicts where they're going to go. You need to prepare them for a huge, broad set of options. And whether you have multiplication tables in that one, I'll leave that up to you guys.
I think that's actually a good segue to our next question, which is, what do you see as the biggest challenges affecting change in schools today, and what strategies or approaches can we use to address these challenges?
From a larger U.S. perspective, we have a very different population of children now than we had even 20 years ago. So in California, in our public schools, a majority of children are Latino, and a very large proportion are English language learners. So and that's true across the country, although particularly true in California, Texas, New York, and some states. So one of the big challenges is addressing the needs of a much more culturally and language diverse population than we have had to address before. The other thing that we have in the U.S., unfortunately, is a rising proportion of children in poverty, and a much larger gap between rich and poor, and a diminishment of middle class resources. So there's this economic divide that has been developing over the last some number of years, which also creates all kinds of challenges on public schools. That's nationwide, it's California. You're in a little bit of a bubble here, or a particular set of circumstances, and so I'm going to move from that, which I think are huge challenges for us as citizens, and think more about what the challenges are for this community. I think one is creating cohesion in the community so that you're on the same page, that you are working together in a collaborative way, parents and teachers and administrators, toward a common set of goals. That's hard to do. You know, especially, and I think sometimes the more educated the population, the more difficult that is. So, because people have strong views about what schools need to look like, what they need to do, and what they care about in their children. So that, I think, is a big challenge. I love the process that has been begun, because the best way to get there is a lot of conversation and a lot of listening to each other, which is hard to do sometimes. The next big challenge is, once those goals, those community goals are set, is achieving them. We are putting so many demands on teachers. I mean, huge expectations on what they should be doing for our kids. Character development, in addition to all the very demanding intellectual expectations that we have and that are being added to by the Common Core. So being mindful that you as a community are going to be asking a lot of your schools, and that it won't happen like that, and that it'll be some false starts, and some things that they try that won't succeed, and understanding that these are major changes and new demands that are being put on people who already have a lot of demands put on them, and being, I think, somewhat patient, but also having that clear goal in mind and being supportive of getting there. So that, I think, it's just hard to change the way you teach. And luckily, you're in a community where you're not having to go from here to here. But there are some changes that are probably going to happen. And it's not that easy. It takes time, it takes some experimentation, and it takes a lot of very careful ongoing assessment to make sure that what you're doing is working. A lot of schools will try something, and then at the end of the year they look at their California assessments and say, oh wow, that didn't work. Well, don't wait till the end of the year. I think it's really important that you do assessments as you go, so that you can either reverse or move in a slightly direction, or correct the direction you're going in, so that you're learning all the time and making improvements and making sure that you're being effective for all kids.
So how else can we be supportive of our teachers? What else have you seen work in other districts or in other schools, besides, having the patience, and what else can we do as parents to help the staff that needs so much help?
I would ask the staff that, because I don't know the specific needs. Certainly being patient and not being coming in and complaining the first thing. Sometimes teachers will make mistakes, and sometimes, occasionally, even in good schools, you get teachers who are just not up to par. So I don't mean letting go whatever is happening, whether you think it's good or bad, but I think being a little bit patient, talking to the teacher, listening to the teacher, and being a partner in education with your child, so that we know that it takes parents and teachers to really educate a child, not just for character development and those kinds of qualities, but even for math and science and some very basic kinds of skills. Parents, especially if children, for children who are extremely fast learners, sometimes parents can help by providing enrichment opportunities and sort of supplementing what goes on in the classroom to make sure that those kids are constantly challenged and engaged in the learning process. For kids who have special needs, or kids who take a little longer to process the information and to get on top of it, there are often things that parents can do to help with that. So to work with teachers on that. But I would ask the teachers, especially after you get further along in your process, and say, okay, now how can what can everyone in this community do to keep this moving along to achieve the goals that we've set as a community?
Deborah,
think of any districts either locally here or in California that we might be able to look to that have done a really effective or a pretty good job of change management that we could say, hey, let's go talk to them and see what they learned?
That's an interesting question. Most of the districts I know that are really doing deep reform are failing districts.
Yeah.
They're very different. They're trying to get their kids up to within a year of grade level. You're trying to you're going to come out with, and you already have, ambitious goals.
How about comparing?
Yeah, and nothing comes to mind. Maybe I certainly know, like the lab school that I worked in Southern California was
about that, about how you supported teachers there and some of the.
Yeah. One of the things to think about is that reform isn't something that you do. People used to ask me, how long does it take?
Yeah.
You know, is it a year, 2 years? Reform is an ongoing dynamic process, and it never stops. So I think the first thing to realize, and the way we tried to change the culture of the lab school, was this is a learning organization. We are constantly learning, setting goals as a community, measuring whether we're achieving those goals, making adjustments when we're not, maybe setting higher goals when we are, or slightly different goals. And so it's a process that never ends. It's creating a culture within the school that it's never, in some respects, it's never good enough. Or you're always looking for new opportunities. And I don't mean that in a frustrating way, in a wow, I went to this conference and they're doing some of the coolest things with technology, and I think it'll help us address this particular problem we have that we haven't been able to solve. So being open to new ideas, being honest about where things aren't working well, or where they're working really well for some kids but not well for other kids. So what do we do to bring those other kids around? So there's just sort of continual assessment of where you are going toward meeting your goals, having clarity on the goals, whether you're moving toward them, and what needs to be tweaked. And it's a learning cycle. So I think that's what we try to establish in our lab school. You also have to create structures that support that. So one of the things we did, which I'm not necessarily recommending, it worked for us, we identified, I think it was 4 or 5 teachers who became instructional leaders in particular areas. So we had one in math and science, one in reading, one in technology, I think one in social studies, maybe there were only 4. Those teachers were given time off. So they were in the classroom, I think 3.5 or 4 days a week. They were out of the classroom 5 days a week. So we did a lot of creative structuring of the school day to be able to have some teachers out of the classroom. What did they do during that time that they were out of the classroom? One thing they did was develop their own skills, so they really became expert. So we invested in some regards in their knowledge and skills. They spend time looking at curriculum materials and things like that, or looking at on the web at various technology opportunities that might be brought into the school. And then the teachers met every 2 weeks, I think, in those subject area groups, and so they planned sort of the curriculum across and the goals across the school. So they oversaw changes in math and science, or in literacy, the literacy program or whatever. Those people also became sort of mentors to our new teachers. So they were formally given responsibility for the relatively novice teachers to make sure that they had observations, that they had feedback, and so on. They would sometimes go in and do model lessons for teachers who were either struggling or just wanted some new ideas and new ways of doing things. So we created that structure, and then a meeting structure, so that the teachers met once a week, either in grade group meetings or in subject matter group meetings, where they were constantly looking at student data, analyzing what kids were learning, trying to figure out where they weren't, helping develop new strategies and so on. So you can't just say, we're going to be a learning organization. You have to build in structures to make sure that teachers have those opportunities. One of the things that parents can do sometimes is bring in resources, and they know things in the community that teachers may not know about that can be brought in, particularly in technology innovations and things like that.
Going back to online learning, I know that academically it's a great way to reinforce some of the skills. Is anyone working on, or is there an online program that kind of reinforces the social emotional learning that they get from school, or is it being developed? Is it being thought about? You know, is there anything of that sort?
Yeah. Well, Sesame Street. You've got some media that have made that a specific goal. There probably are. I think I'm a little skeptical in how much you can learn about how well it works for developing social skills. I think they probably are better developed in social contexts.
Right, but in terms of, and I'm not talking, it's not so much about the development, but reinforcing some of the things that they get in the social emotional context, like reinforcing responsibility or respect.
Yeah,
or, just kind of
you
getting them to think about it a little more.
I suspect that there are. I don't know of them. I don't know that there aren't. I mean, certainly TV, there have been TV shows that have been very focused on, all kinds of social skills. But I suspect that some of those TV shows have moved into the internet games and other things terrain, but it's not an area that I have a lot of expertise in. I could find out for you whether there are people. I know there are people on our faculty who have really encouraged and studied how collaboration in a computer context can develop collaborative skills. Although one thing that was found in one study I read not too long ago was that when you have mixed gender groups, you have to be careful because the boys will often control the mouse, and whoever controls the mouse controls the situation. So there are some gender issues that need to be looked at if you do that.
I'm not sure I fully developed this question, but I think that most of us are here because we love this community, and there's a low level of frustration within the community where we want more, and so then we go out and we look at other schools and see what they're doing, and I mean they're private schools, they're not public schools. So when Sharon just asked to look at other public schools that were in our community, I'm wondering if realistically we wouldn't take our child out for a quote unquote better education in another public school. We would take them. We just had this discussion, that's why I'm bringing this up with Sharon. We're talking about where you would take your child is to a private school. And it seems like the people that I've talked to who send their children to private schools, a lot of the positive things that they see is a lot more individuality between the children. And it seems like, the class sizes are about the same and they have one teacher, but somehow they get more individual attention. And I don't know, it seems to me, this is sort of different, but I don't know how this aligns, but our district seems a little bit, our teachers don't seem very cohesive to me, and it seems like we're not all moving in the same direction. And so I have had fantastic teachers. I love my teachers for last year and this year, but I don't feel like I'm moving in the same direction. And I guess that's along with decide what you want to have for your children and then move in that direction. It seems like that's really important, but super important. I think that's what we clearly need to do is decide what we all want and then move towards that. But I think that it would be helpful for us to look at private schools as well, because that really is our district's competition. And I don't know if that's feasible since we don't have the budgets they have or not, but it seems like it would be a good idea to look at them. And you said they have different standards. Are their standards pretty much the same as our standards? They just don't, it's not like our standards. But I mean, the people I've talked to, their kids are, my kids are in first grade and their kids are a year ahead of my kids, and my kids are happy. I'm not saying I want my kids sitting in front of doing homework every day. I'm just wondering how they figure out their standards and then how Why are we so different? Why does everyone want to go to a private school versus going to our school? When my kids seem happy and I want to stay here, but I don't feel consistency, I guess.
Well,
Sorry, that was all over the place.
It's actually a really good, I think it's a really good question. One thing this is an aside, which is ahead isn't necessarily better.
Right.
We do have this kind of, I don't know if any of you saw the movie Race to Nowhere, but we do have this sort of sense of more is better or being ahead is better, and I'm not a subscriber to that. Deeper is better, passion is good. Yes. I mean, there are a lot of things that I care deeply about in education that you can't measure on a continuum. I love seeing children really passionately engaged in what they're doing, and sometimes that means deeper, or it means connecting with material that is personally meaningful. So just further along is not necessarily better. So that's an aside. I would look at any school you find interesting at what they're doing, and not necessarily because you want to say we want to be just like that school, but you want to look at other ways of doing things or alternative ways of doing things, whether it's the way they do teacher professional development, or the ways they've achieved greater cohesion among teachers, or how they use technology, or how they individualize instruction, or what kinds of project learning they do, and how effective is it. So I visit private schools, I visit public schools, I visit all kinds of schools, and I'm willing to borrow ideas and share them wherever they make sense. The difference between, but it has to be realistically implementable in this community with the resources that you have, and so I think there are certain realities that may limit what you can do. I paid private school tuition. I know how much money they have per pupil. It's, you know, upwards of $30,000, and that's before, you know, all the extra money. So I'm assuming you don't have $30,000 per pupil, and so you're not going to be able to offer all the same things.
But at the same time, we're not that far off. I mean, we're like at $16,000 per pupil plus the foundation. So it's not. If you look at just dollars, it seems like resources are not that far off. So what is it that?
Well, that's. I don't want to. I just want to. I don't want to get into how far off. I think you have to look at what they're doing, and if you, as a broad community, think it's worth doing, then the next question is, can we do it? And what, or if we do it, what might we have to give up? Because it often means sort of moving around priorities and things like that. So I wouldn't ever restrict who you look at or where you go. I think you want to get the best ideas from every place. The thing that's different, though, for me, in a regular public school and a private school, is that the school needs to be fair and appropriate and meet the needs of all children. So you can't have a situation where half the children in the school thrive with this kind of innovation, but the other half are left behind. Private school can say, don't come here if your child doesn't have a strong interest in math and science, or doesn't love technology, or doesn't want to be an engineer when he grows up, or whatever it is. But as a public school, you can't do that. You can't say to your community, don't bring your children here if they have particular kinds of interests or qualities. So the only restriction I would put on what you borrow is, or the two restrictions, is what are the resources, and the second is, will it work for most children? The third, which I haven't mentioned, is teachers are critically important in these decisions, and I have seen many times all the parents get very excited, it's not even divided, about a particular approach, but the teachers are just completely not on board. The one thing I can tell you, or most are not, the one thing I can tell you is that you cannot, as parents, impose some kind of innovation or approach on teachers. You can't impose it. They have to be part of they have to own it. And to own it means they're part of that conversation, and they're part of the people who construct this as an important goal and something they want to do in the school. So don't have any fantasies of going out and figuring out what to do and then coming back and saying, okay, teachers, from now on you'll do it this way. And we'll even pay for all your professional development.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah.
Because we have a handful of fabulous teachers on our steering committee, but it's only a handful, right? You can't have every teacher on the steering committee. So how do we create something, whatever that something is, that the teachers as a, you know, as a group are excited about and behind, and don't feel like it's being imposed on them?
Well, I think we engage them in all the conversations. So I think it's very much a two-way, three-way, four-way communication all the time of coming back. I'm pleased to see so many teachers here this afternoon. I think although we only have a handful of teachers on the committee, they represent others and they're talking. There's lots of buzz around the campuses. There's lots of concern, I think, around the campuses about exactly what Deborah just talked about. But I don't think that they're disengaged from the conversation. I think they're very much engaged in the conversation and will continue to be so in more, you know, much more deeply as we go forward. And I think, you know, another point that Deborah brought up that is our opportunity right now. One of the things that, as you said, private schools have going for them is this, you know, kind of branding, and you're buying the brand when you go there. Well, what we're doing right now is establishing our new Portola Valley brand, what we're going to be about. And I think having everybody at the table, whether it's virtual or real at the table, is going to help us get everybody in a shared direction, which will make us stronger as a group. It's going to be hard because there's probably lots and lots of opinions out there. But I think there are many, many things we would agree on. And I think one of the first places we start with that conversation is, what do we want for kids? And I think when we have that conversation, there's much greater agreement when we talk about the children as opposed to talking about the adults. So I'm hoping that's where our conversation will mostly go over the next several weeks and months and years, perhaps, as I think you're very right about reform not having needs to have an ing on it, right? So, okay, I'm going to move us to our third question, and then of course we'll open it up to all kinds of questions. So, and this I think is a topic near and dear to your heart, as you were just saying it. What do you see as the essential elements in a K-8 school to really ensure that children are engaged and motivated to learn? You wrote a whole book about that, right? So 2 whole books about it. So, and when you go into a classroom, what do you look for to say, okay, this is a classroom where kids are engaged and motivated?
Love this question. People who study motivation often differentiate between 3 components of motivation. One is behavioral. They're actually engaged in the work. So if kids are sitting in their desks and looking out the window, then they're not behaviorally engaged. The second is emotional. And that's things like enthusiasm, passion, pride in accomplishment. When you see smiles on their faces, or you see just boredom written all over their faces. I mean, you can tell what their sort of affective connection is, usually by looking at them. When kids refuse to go out to recess because they want to finish something, that's a good evidence that they're deeply, intrinsically, and emotionally engaged. The third is cognitively engaged, that they are actually intellectually working. I want all 3. I'm very ambitious, but I at least want cognitively engaged. And a lot of what I see that teachers and parents are satisfied with is what I would call behavioral engagement. I see this particularly in project learning. I cannot tell you how many classrooms I've seen where the kids are just busily and quite happily engaged in some sort of activity. And the parents go by and go, oh, I love this teacher. She's so good. She really engages the kids. So, but the kids aren't learning anything. They're not intellectually engaged. And I will give an example from the school that I directed with some embarrassment. Actually, my daughter was in this class. So this is 3rd grade, 2nd, 3rd grade. So the kids are cutting out these various shapes and then bending over tabs and things to make them into like boxes or rectangle, 3-dimensional things or whatever. And then they're pasting them together and making these, complicated structures. So for 3 days I go by and they're still working on this. So I say to the teacher, so what's this about? You know, what's the learning goal here? And she says, oh, they're learning about geometry. It's like, what about geometry? I mean, all I could see is they were learning how to cut and paste. And I think, in fact, they were learning how to cut and paste, and they were having a heck of a fun time doing it. But there were no cognitive demands in this task whatsoever. So what I ask when I see kids engage in some kind of so-called learning activity is, what are they learning? Where are the cognitive challenges? Where does this task require that they actually persist over some period of time and run into challenges from time to time that they have to overcome? And have this sense of pride in accomplishment because they've had to persist and do it. So you can't always tell that by looking. One very telling thing for me is when you ask the teacher, what is the intellectual goal here? What is the academic goal? They should be able to articulate it. And it should be an academic goal that you can actually determine whether the kids have got there. So when she says they're learning about geometry, it's like, how will you know when they have learned about geometry? Well, it wasn't fully articulated what it was that they were learning. If you can't articulate what they're learning, then you can't determine whether or not they've learned it. So I want to see instruction that engages kids' minds deeply and actively, and their emotions. And behavior comes with that, because your mind, I mean, it may be intellectual activity, but you have to be actively engaged. We I think, gave up the learning while you're sleeping sort of idea a long time ago. And luckily, a lot is known about what are the kinds of instructional activities and teaching that promotes those kinds of deep cognitive, emotional, and behavioral engagement.
So I've got a question that sort of touches on all the topics that we've been discussing this evening, and it relates to your colleague at Stanford, Dr. Dweck, talking about the whole idea of growth mindset. And so it speaks to social emotional learning, it speaks to content acquisition, it speaks to motivation, it speaks to structural change. And I'm curious about how we best affect a structural and a cognitive shift like that towards this idea away from success versus failure, and this idea of growth and measuring growth over time, and recognizing that if you start at square one and you make it to square 5, even if you didn't make it to 10 at the end, that's still growth. And I'm curious about how we best affect that, because I think the point you made that we have a lot of capital here in this district in terms of where we are already at, that we're not worried about API and program improvement, about how we make that shift while still functioning within an overall system that requires us to measure progress, and where our students sometimes, even if they stay with us K through 8, might be moving on to private high schools that are more in that kind of traditional fixed mindset. So how do we take that shift, both in terms of staff that we're talking about, teaching kids to appreciate learning for learning's sake, while still recognizing that in the end, yes, you have to get a grade, and maybe the C isn't what you liked, but it's way better than where you were at before. So I think that's a challenge, because I speak to my students about, see how much you've progressed, but there's still very much a focus on kind of that traditional grade result, and then how we function within that larger education system.
I think there's 2 issues there. So first, just for those of you who are not familiar with Carol Dweck's mindset, she differentiates between 2 mindsets. One is what she calls a fixed mindset, which is some kids are smart and some kids are less smart. I see this, in fact, we've been doing some research with teachers recently, especially in math, where some teachers they're good kids. I mean, people will say all the time, I'm just not good at math. You rarely hear someone say, I'm just not good at reading, because it's more socially acceptable to say I'm not good at math. And we see that teachers vary a lot in whether they expect all kids to achieve the standards that they are being held to, or just some of them. And they actually will provide different opportunities for kids as a function of what they see their capacity is. A growth mindset gets rid of the notion of capacity and basically is all kids can learn math. They may learn math at different speeds or with different facility, but they can all learn math. And so my job as a teacher is to get them all there. And for those who get there really fast, to give them opportunities to go deeper or go forward. But there's no kind of, well, these kids are they're not going to ever really get it, so I'm going to kind of let them do as they can, because I'm a really caring teacher and I don't want to hurt their self-esteem and I don't want them to fail. So that's one issue, is that mindset, how you see, and kids begin to develop those mindsets as well. And Carol has shown that the mindsets that children have are highly predictive of how much they persist at tasks and that sort of thing when they run into difficulty. The other issue is whether you're performance-oriented or more learning-oriented. And they're highly related, because if you believe that ability is a fixed trait, then your goal is to demonstrate it, is to show people that you have it. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to learn a lot, because some kids can demonstrate how smart they are without working very hard. And other kids, no matter how hard they work, they're never going to demonstrate how smart they are, because smartness is seen as a kind of relative thing. Versus having an orientation toward every child is trying to learn and develop their skills toward a set of common standards. The culture of the classroom is enormously powerful in this. Parents actually have a strong effect on this too, by the way. So I'm just going to give you one example from the lab school, which I think demonstrates very nicely a culture of, we celebrate learning at every level. So a child came, this was in 4th grade, all of the children in the class had been reading chapter books for years. There was one child who had a reading disability and so was really struggling with reading. And all the kids knew it, you know who's struggling and who. He came in one day and announced that he had read his first chapter book. Now in some classrooms you can see kids going, really? I could read a chapter book when I was in 2nd grade or 1st grade. You sure are slow, or you sure are dumb. Instead, in this classroom, all the kids got together, went to the teacher and asked the teacher if they could buy that book and all sign it and give it to him as a present. I know. Every time I tell this story. And give it to him as a present to celebrate this milestone. That tells you what the culture of that classroom was, is that everyone's learning was celebrated by the entire classroom. They did. And his father came, I was there actually when they gave it to him, so talk about tears. I was in a Montessori middle school not long ago, and I was observing some kids who were on the floor with the teacher. The class was divided into 2 groups. There was the group, the fast learners, and the slower learners, but I didn't know that that's what they were called. It was clear that the one group was more accelerated than the other. The other group was sort of doing work at their desk. So I went around to the kids who were doing work at their desks and I asked them to explain to me what was the difference between the kids who were over there working with the teacher and them. And they said, oh, those are the ones who not are fast learners, who like to go faster. We like to go slower because it's just right for me. And I said, well, don't some of you wish you could be with the ones who like to go faster? No, not really. This is comfortable for us. There was absolutely no embarrassment, no shame, no sense of we're not as good as they are. And they had basically developed this culture in which you learned at different rates. In fact, I asked them, are you going to be as far along in math at the end of the year as they are, because they're going faster? Well, I know the answer is no. There's no way, it just doesn't, you can do the math, it doesn't work. And they all said yes. So they didn't have this concept of smart kids and dumb kids. And some of them told me that, well, in reading, they like to go faster. Well, this turned out to be sort of this was something that kids had started in kindergarten, and these kids were in middle school. So this This view that there are faster and slower learners was clearly something that just permeated the culture from the beginning. And that kids had bought into. I mean, I pushed hard trying to get them, tell me the truth. You really wish you were. No. So I think creating an environment where all kids' learning are celebrated, where there are explanations for differentiated instruction and that sort of thing, where you don't have categories of kids, where you have opportunities for kids to move into different groups, that you don't just provide enrichment activities or project learning for the so-called smart kids, that you really need to think very hard about how you're providing opportunities for all kids. I just want to, I'm going on too long about this, but it happens to be something I'm passionate about. I hate grades. We did not have grades. What does a B tell you? Your kid comes home with a B in science. What do you know? You know absolutely nothing. It provides no information whatsoever. We did not have grades at our lab school. We had detailed information that showed exactly where kids were on highly differentiated levels of skills. So there were like 9 different dimensions in reading. And where they were in their progression toward where we hoped all children would get by the end of the year. And I think it helped create that sense of this is about moving according to what makes sense for you, given your skill levels and so on that you came in with, or whatever other kinds of challenges you have, not about a race or who's the best. But that has to be something that the parents buy into, teachers buy into, and kids learn to buy into, because that is a clear agreement in the community that that's something that you care about.
Question about that. Let's assume that the community as a whole embraces that concept and says, it's better to have a more comprehensive evaluation than a grade. How then are those children evaluated when they're trying to matriculate into a high school or a college environment that looks at grades?
We certainly had absolutely no trouble our kids getting into high schools. They went to middle school from our schools. So teachers wrote long letter. I mean, it's more, this is hugely burdensome on the teachers. So, I should be careful when you come up with no, seriously, careful, because it's easy for parents or outsiders to come in and say, oh, you should do this. But you've got to think about, is that really realistic given the other demands on teachers? So doing these long, so you got to say, if this is something we want to do, where are we going to give? Yeah, because you can't ask teachers to do everything. So just that as an aside. At least in Southern California, almost all the private schools required kids to take a standardized test. I can't remember what it was called.
ISED.
Yeah. So they all took this standardized test. So I think that was part of it. But also they had, a lot of information about the kid. Not just where he was in terms of his skills, but a lot about the kind of learner he was, because the teachers knew the kids really well. So we never got any complaints ever from middle schools. And I don't think you would get complaints from high schools either. And to get into college, they got plenty of scores that they give, and they don't pay as much attention to grades anyway, because they mean much less than the scores do. So I don't think most colleges would care a whole lot.
On that same subject, this is an interesting district because it doesn't have grades for the first 5 grades, 6 years, and then does for the middle school. And I've never heard a good reason why that's true. But I would argue that there is a climate change at middle school, and there's enormous focus on these grades. In fact, at the first back-to-school night I ever attended for the middle school, when my daughter was starting 6th grade, every single teacher discussed only, as far as I heard, the rubric for the grade in the class. And there's a great deal of focus on which hoops you jump through and how, including even things like which notebook you buy and all this kind of stuff that seemed to me quite unrelated to learning. And I do think it changes the culture. And there's a kind of panic that then sets in, I think, which, at least in my experience, and it reinforces a feeling that I think is already there in the community, that this is a race. and that some people are going to get there and some people won't, which begins very strongly, very prominently in kindergarten in this school district with focus on who's going to win the reading, you know, which number book you're reading. And which I think can be particularly troubling, obviously, for the kids who are struggling, as my kids did with certain things, but I think also can work against the learning of the kids who feel that they're doing well, too, because then, you know, we got it figured, we got it done, and the learning kind of goes away as a goal. And it really isn't, in my view, necessary at all. I mean, I went to schools that had no grades. I got to Stanford, which had grades. I decided not to take grades. Everybody was, oh my God, how are you going to get into medical school? I got into medical school. The medical schools didn't have grades either. You know, I mean, where there's consensus that there's very little correlation between grades and how people perform afterwards, we have to wonder, why are we doing this? And what does it mean about what we choose for our culture?
My job is just to throw out stuff. It's your job to figure out. I just want to throw out some really controversial things to make sure you have some lively conversations. So I can see you're going to have one on this one.
Do you have any suggestions on how we can make our community more cohesive and build, you know, just community building? In addition, I mean, I think this is wonderful, and not everybody's here, but I'm so excited that this is happening, and I just want more, and I'd like everybody to be more on the same page, whether they are or not. And also, I don't like grades, but that's a, you know, do you have suggestions about how we could?
Well, my first suggestion is don't use the U.S. Congress as your model. Be prepared to compromise, because you've got a broad set of views and perspectives, and you have to understand that you're not going to always win your particular position. You know, I think being good listeners to each other, and understanding that where you go and what those priorities are and what kind of school you decide you want these to be, schools you decide you want these to be, are going to be something that is to some degree a consensus. And also something that teachers will have to buy into. So if you go in thinking, I want consensus, but I want it my way, then you're never going to get consensus, because that's what we have in the U.S. Congress. So I think just being open to compromise and listening and understanding, and always keeping the kids in mind. So often these conversations get to be more about the adults than about the kids, and just making sure that that's at the forefront of what the conversation is about. You know, I think from what I see, a really good process is being started here. You know, you got to start in a small committee. You can't have you got to go back and forth from a small group to large groups, because it's very hard to get anywhere in a large group. But certainly plenty of opportunities for everybody to have a voice. You could probably, I don't know if you plan on doing this, but you can set up sort of chat rooms where you can throw out ideas, and so that parents who don't have time to come to meetings but love to get on the web can have some input. So there are lots of ways now that you can really facilitate and make it easy to collect perspectives. But whatever decisions are made is going to be a sort of compromise of many different points of views.
I think it's so important that our community arrives at some sort of consensus, but I also feel like, how do we motivate the teachers? Because, I mean, they're being paid for their school day, and here they are in the evening, you know, sitting here. I mean, how do we motivate them? We've got great teachers, and we want to make sure they're on board, and are not only on board, but are driving with us this consensus. So how do you see other communities or school districts or private schools or whatever it is we're comparing ourselves to, how do we motivate our teachers to want to be involved in setting the direction, and then once it's set, engaged in, you know, helping move it forward?
I think creating structures that make it easy for them to have a voice and to discuss these things, I think that's really kind of up to you and the principals to do. Making sure that they feel like their perspectives are valued, that the immediate reaction is not, oh, these teachers, They just never want to change. I mean, that I see that a lot. It's try to understand what is it that you see are the impediments for the kinds of changes we're asking, so that you're hearing their perspective and listening to it and showing that you value it. And keeping in mind that this change is really hard for teachers. It's really hard because it's a hard job. You got a lot of kids in your classroom, you're trying to meet all of their needs, and it's just harder than any parent can possibly imagine. I have never been a real teacher. I took a classroom once, and it was a complete disaster. I literally had to go out. I could not control the classroom, and it was like, wow, this is I really appreciated the complexity of the job in that one moment. They never let me take a classroom again. So I think just making sure that they have the time and have a voice and listening to their voice. I think whatever you move forward with, most of the teachers will come along with. They may say, give us time. Don't expect this to happen overnight. Give us 3 years to get some of these new innovations or approaches up and running. And give us the kind of support that we need to be able to do it well. So teachers care about their kids. If they resist your idea, it's because they don't think it's going to work for their kids. So part of it is listening to why and maybe coming up with examples or observations or things like that that will help them open their eyes to things that they may not have seen or be used to.
I just wanted to say something about volunteering, getting more involved. So this little group, this has been organized by 4 people, and we are working underneath the strategic planning committee, but we're just volunteering, and we just got together and decided to volunteer. If you guys have ideas, you want to have a coffee one morning, and I think that what we're doing is, there could be a lot more, but I am thrilled that everybody is here and that people are talking about this outside of school. And so Sharon and Stacy's in the back, and Karen Tate, if you guys want to come and talk to us, any idea you have, you can help us, because we are pretty much overloaded right now. And we love it. And we have a lot of ideas, but we only have so little time. And so if you guys have some ideas, we just talked today about doing a movie night, which we're going to do in a couple months. But the social kind of thing will bring us together and create a community. And I think that that's what we certainly want to retain that. And I want the teachers to come to those things too. And we're trying to make it work for the teachers, the timing. And if you guys are interested in something and want us to bring lunch to you so we can talk about it at Corte Madera or Armendale, that's why we're volunteering, because we want everyone to be a part of our community and be awesome. So please,
actually,
you guys, just come to us.
Acknowledge the 4 of you.
I'm not asking for acknowledgement, I'm just saying it. Don't look at me, there's 4 of us. And I'll let Vance bring the coffee.
And Daphne will.
And
Daphne, sorry.
And Daphne. And group as well. And all 5 of you, just tremendous work. They bring me in to tell me a few things they've done, and it's just, wow, okay. Just tremendous effort. This doesn't just happen, so really, really appreciate it.
And we have lovely speakers who come and help us too, which is really pretty amazing.
Yeah, and he says he's going to take all the wrinkles off my face.
Wow, awesome.
So yes, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. We really appreciate it. I think it's been a very enriching afternoon, very informative, and really appreciate it. It's like a problem.
Thank you very much.
I just want to say that I am really impressed. I am just totally wowed by the level of commitment and the enthusiasm and the amount you care about the education of your kids. And I wish every community had this kind of involvement. And I wish you all well in what I think will be a really engaging, and it will be emotionally and cognitively process.
Thank you. Thank you all.